Welcome to the Integral Stage Sexuality Series. I'm Layman Pascal, and before I host my high-priced week-long workshop on integrative sexuality at a seaside Caribbean resort, I need to make sure I've been fully exposed to the multidimensional richness and profundity of this topic. A topic that most people find deeply physically compelling, emotionally significant, and for some people intellectually fascinating and brimming with spiritual and developmental potential. Here to share the ins and outs of their understanding is... Tell us who you are and where you are.
I am right now in Berkeley, California. This is not Berkeley, California. This is a basalt cave at a tide line in Northern Ireland. But, I share a very small space with my husband, and it's tidy but very cluttered. So I'm being merciful on anybody watching this and showing this instead.
Okay, now the question that sort of triggered this is a question that's been going around in Integral and Metamodern and GameB communities, but also in all kinds of more advanced discourse communities for years. It's the question of, where are the women? So hypothetically, they're about 50% of the population. They're, 40% of the prominent thinkers, but they're 10 to 20% at best of the people who show up in these discussions. Bruce and I have several of these podcast series, and it's very difficult, even when you reach out to women, to get them to come on, except for on certain topics that they seem to prefer rather than others. So what's your general take on the way and the degree to which women show up in these spaces?
Well, I've noticed the same phenomenon to the degree I show up at all. I've noticed this very much. For instance, I went to Ken Wilber's What Now conference 3 years ago, and 1 out of 5 presenters was female, although in the audience it was much more evenly balanced. But I noticed a big difference, and this may end up pointing us toward an answer. I don't have an answer off the top of my head, but we'll explore this. I have some ideas of avenues to explore. Sure. One of which was what I observed was of the presenters at that very high-powered conference. I mean, it knocked my socks off. It changed my life. The female presenters seemed much more in their bodies. The men, I say this with respect. They tended to be heads on sticks, a term I'm sure most of you have heard before. And I don't mean as an insult. I mean, and this is where we went in that conversation you and I were in last Friday. Men who operate at these very high advanced levels tend to be in their intellects and hardly embodied at all. I'm thinking of a world-renowned physicist whose name I've forgotten, who attended a super high-power conference on string theory in Manhattan and then forgot how to drive home. He couldn't remember how to drive home afterwards. That's an extreme example. But come to think of it, I've noticed this phenomenon in my experience in academia. When I was a graduate school, even among the humanities, the professors tended to be more just not grounded in the immediate physical reality and in the relationships, the interrelatedness. It was like a theory, spinning these theories and just kind of oblivious to what was going on around them at an interpersonal level. Not all of them. I don't think that's the answer particularly, because I can certainly get up in my intellect and spin on and on. No, but I'll just wind it down there as a general observation. The women tended to be more in their bodies, in their emotions, kind of grounded at all levels, even the high-performing women.
The image that gives me is of that it's easier for a number of fairly obvious reasons, historically and physiologically, for the men to abstract themselves from their bodies. Yeah. Therefore, that puts them in a privileged position to explore very abstract topics.
Yes.
However,
men are out there, let's face it. We women are in here.
The idea that there were a lot more women in the audience than on the stage is very interesting, because I often think one of the answers to where are the women, like, for example, in a podcast, is they're somewhere else in the same house. Like a lot of these men that you see are going to have a conversation about these topics with a woman before and after the broadcast, but they're not necessarily showing up on the broadcast stage in the same way. So they're able to understand, and they are showing up, but they're not necessarily showing up in that self-presentation mode.
Yes. Now, actually, that sparks off two lines of thought here. So let's try to mark them both so I don't forget them. And one is just the self-presentation. The men, and I think we can go back into evolutionary biology for this. The men express themselves out there. The women contain the world in here, right? So the women, certainly culturally, we are less encouraged to express ourselves out there. We're encouraged to be the holders. There may be a biological component to that too, and we're treading in dangerous waters here. But let me see, what was the other theme? Yeah, just in terms of of social history, the women run the household, the women raise the children. Up until the post-World War II society, which was the sixth world stage, the postmodern era, running a household and raising children was a more than full-time job. You are constantly working, especially if you're raising children. And let's face it, until the pill was invented, if a woman's going to have sex, she's going to have children. She's going to end up raising children. The women are left holding the babies. Up until my lifetime, I remember when the pill came out, up until my lifetime, this was just the way the world ran. If you are an adult female expressing your sexuality, which means unless you're a nun or you're barren, you're going to have babies. Babies are more than full-time. You're never off. You're constantly, until they're having babies of their own, then you're helping your daughters with their babies. So you are working round the clock right there and keeping a household up until the post-World War II society, just running a household. In Ursula Le Guin's wonderful term, housewives create order where people live. Housewives negate entropy. That's work. To negate entropy, you have to put in work. And this is one of my mottos, by the way, going forward. Homo sapiens negates entropy. This is what we bring to this. Look at the entropy we've negated. Look at Manhattan, that magnificent termite mound. And I think that's a good thing, by the way. But housewives are the ones who've been doing this, and that's been pushed to the background. I don't see capitalism quite as critically as I think you do, but one of the unfortunate side effects of the modern world is the focus on the external, the male productivity, where you put things out there, which has benefited us all. I mean, the average life expectancy now is pushing 80 in the advanced parts of the world, where 200 years ago it was 30 or 40 at best. I mean, not to denigrate the achievements of modernity, but the typical women's sphere, which held it all together and raises the children and raises the next generation, has been marginalized. What we do, caring for children, caring for the ill, caring for the elderly, traditionally, keeping order where people live, putting the meals on the table, tidying up until well after World War II, that was a more than full-time job. And that was part of the contribution. This has been just taken so for granted that it's like raising children is something you do in your spare time, tiny house, the house is something you do in your spare time, excuse me. One of my hopes for this, the age to come, our next emerging world order, is re-evaluating and valuing that aspect of the contribution and seeing the value in it. And we may have to monetize it for a while, like how much would I have to pay if I had to hire somebody to provide this service or that service or that service. But I see that's part of the massive shift of era that we're in, is to see just how necessary that aspect is. And that gets to the point you made leading in.
One of the things we really don't know about how modern economies function is how well they would function if we added in quantities from a more diverse set of values, right? If we could monetize or at least quantify that work and enter it into the market, just like if we could quantify the ecological resources we have and enter them into the market, things like that. What kind of a market would we have then? We can't really judge it on the form that we have at the moment. But this is very interesting, what you're saying.
Go ahead.
So there was a specific general cultural role for women, which changed fairly recently, as a result of both some cultural factors and some physical technological factors, like the invention of contraception, or at least modern chemical contraception.
Yeah.
And so there has been this change, but obviously the residual momentum of the patterns of all of human history are still going.
Yes.
So there are all these spaces in which the men have had an enormous head start, even though the women are now getting more practical liberty in order to enter these spaces. It'll still
Yes.
take a while for them to migrate into them at whatever the natural rate is.
Yes, yes, and there may always be some gender-based differences in aggregate. You know, individuals are you can't apply generalizations to individuals, but certain spheres may always be more represented by females than males, and vice versa. We don't know until we find out. But it's been a huge advance for women, on the one hand, that we can earn a living in a marketplace because we're not dependent on the man. Our economic survival is not dependent on the man that our father sold us to, or we chose when we were 16 and didn't know what the hell we were doing. On the other hand, there's this expectation now that women participate in the economic marketplace on an equal basis with men, which we're certainly capable of doing, except for certain things like, you know, upper body strength. At the same time, we're raising the children and keeping house. And, you know, this is a very well-worn subject. So we're still catching up with ourselves. I don't think we have collectively wrapped our minds around just what a huge thing modern chemical contraception is. I mean, that completely changes the equation. There's so many reasons for the traditional worldview where if you're a woman, you have your man, you have your children, you are in a protected space because you need that protected space to raise a baby. And the man provides it, and that's expected. I mean, we've moved out of that, but collectively, culturally, we haven't quite caught up with just what a massive change safe, available, affordable contraception is.
I'm
changes
surprised
everything.
how few people really touch on that subject. Jordan Peterson brings it up sometimes, and it really is a massive historical rupture in the sense that sexuality and reproduction and all these economic factors were so closely tied together for the entire history of, you know, even before our species.
Right.
Now they're decoupled, both in the sense that you can have sex without reproduction, and in the sense that we're learning to reproduce humans without sexuality to some degree.
Yes.
Right? So that's, you know, if we could stand back and look at the timeline, we would see something starting here that we've barely begun to see the results of. It's going to take centuries or thousands of years to understand what a significant thing that is.
Yeah.
The basic operating system of reproductive life on this planet.
It doesn't get more basic than that.
Now, there's another question that came up to me, which is there's a psychological and a economic practical dimension to busyness, right? Women are busy raising children, running households, you know, working in their own jobs, taking care of all the things they need to take care of.
Mm-hmm.
Very often things that just doesn't enter the men's mind to look after. But there is an element of difference in the male-female brain structure, where the male
Agreed.
brain structure tends to be a little more focused, has more myelinated sheathing on the neurons, gets a little tunnel visioned, whereas the female brain is more gregarious and diverse.
Yes.
And takes more things into account. Now that can lead to a feeling that you're much busier than you are, that you're constantly
Yes.
bombarded and cluttered by things from all these dimensions, and you don't know which way to go at it. So there's a sense in which I am practically, as a woman, too busy to get up on stage or be on a podcast. There's also a sense in which my brain just tells me I'm too busy because I'm tracking so many things simultaneously.
Yes, the upside of that is that my observed experience, seat of the pants, is that women tend to be better at multitasking than men. Now, if you have a small child, you are multitasking, and it's exhausting. I chose not to have children. It was a choice because of the pill. But those of my friends who had children, I would just watch the lines of fatigue etch into their faces, like by the month. And what was the most exhausting is, when I'd go spend time with them in their homes or out having coffee or whatever, more exhausting than the round the clock, you're always having to do something or intervene. The one really exhausting, mind-numbingly exhausting thing was having your train of thought interrupted, having to multitask. Like in the middle of a sentence, you stop and deal with what your toddler's doing, and then have to come back to what you're stirring on the stove, and then come back to the conversation you were having. Just going out for coffee with a friend with a toddler. We would literally take turns holding the toddler. I would hold the toddler for 5 minutes while my friend could drink part of her latte, because if she had the toddler on her lap, she couldn't finish a sentence, or she couldn't take a sip of her latte because she had to be attending to that baby, that toddler. And then when the toddler was on my lap, that was her chance to finish a sentence, to finish a paragraph, to sip her latte. Just the inability to get through even a sentence or a paragraph without having to switch and be multitasking. It's brutally exhausting. And I think women, in my experience, tend to be better at it than the men, because historically we've always been the ones holding the babies, or mostly. Now, the upside of that, you have the downside of that, you've brilliantly explained. But also, I think it's not so much that, because we can focus, and those of us who meditate, I know you meditate, or at least you pretend to meditate, like I pretend to meditate. That meditation is precisely practicing focusing and keeping your focus, and both genders can benefit by that. I think men tend to spin out more in their abstract intellects, where women tend to spin out more in the busy tasks. I've got to get this done. I've got to get this done. But we can both spin out. And what I love, I'm unusual. I'm a contrarian. Have always had a fondness for male nerds. I grew up in Livermore, California. My dad, dear daddy, was a nuclear physicist at Lawrence Radiation Laboratory. I grew up around very high-powered nerds. I'm very comfortable with guys who are so in that tunnel vision, and that tends to be, and it called it attention deficit beyond a certain level. But I don't see it as a deficit. I see it as an alternate where you can be so hyper-focused on what fascinates you. You can go so far into it. And some of our most productive geniuses, I'm thinking Steve Jobs and Elon Musk and so on, tend to have those kinds of wirings. But there's the danger part there. And this is the counterpoint to what you just said about women being too scattered among busyness. The male nerd, high functioning nerd counterpart is to be so into your tunnel vision that you are not communicating. You may be seeing patterns, brilliant. You may be just the world's greatest genius, but you are not necessarily able to communicate with any other human being. And so I grew up in a community where there are a lot of guys like that who are so into their abstract intellect, they weren't really connecting with anybody else. And they always seem kind of lost. Even as a young school child, they seem kind of lost. And I would just kind of go play. You just kind of sit with them and just kind of listen. Even if I didn't understand what they were saying, I thought it was kind of sweet. So even though I don't function at, the 190 IQ level, I'm not there, but I've always had kind of a fondness, which is why I didn't run screaming out of that group on Friday.
Right. Yeah, I was going to ask you that. You think your ability to show up in these spaces is, to some degree anchored in the ability to socially and emotionally appreciate that kind of brain functioning, and that some other women who are intellectually quite capable of showing up might be socially and emotionally wary of engaging with that kind of mind space.
Yes, because when you're dealing with male nerds at that level, the interpersonal skill has to come pretty entirely from this side, and the reward is that they're just, I think all of us crave the attention of others. We are, with very few exceptions, intensely gregarious social creatures. This goes way back into our pre-human history. And my experience with these guys is they're just even if they don't know how to talk, they're just so grateful somebody's there and just hanging with them, and it just seems kind of sweet. So and I have a fairly high-powered intellect myself, but it's more in the humanities side. But I've never thought of it in these terms, but thinking it through with you, it's the engagement, the emotional, social connection skills tended to have to come over 90% from my side. And that's just something I got used to growing up.
So it seems like, if the male thinkers could tune into the emotional and the social dimension in a different way that might be more inviting, do you think there's a way for them to make that space more accessible?
Oh, I'm sure there is. It's just a matter of discovering it. And where my mind is going from this is not really a non sequitur, but it's a jump. Once again, that wonderful conference 3 years ago, Ken Wilber's What Now conference, a number of the presenters knocked my socks off, but the one who knocked my socks off the most was a woman, Ginny Whitelaw, and she does very high power consulting for CEOs. She's a black belt Aikido, and she's consults with executives for how to be more efficient, how to use the principles of Aikido in dealing with their high powered environments. And we were talking about, of course, this is a Ken Wilber conference, so we were talking about second tier, third tier, as we go into the higher stages of individual development and of collective cultural development. And the question arose, how do you engage with somebody who is very different than you are, to the degree that it doesn't feel like there's any common ground? And her answer, now I think she's at a pretty high level herself, her answer was a very female one. You meet them where they are and you fall in love with them. And that's been kind of resonating in me ever since. And I think, that's kind of the way I've been doing this all along. I've been in some male and all male environments where there was a lot of power stuff going on. I've been on an all male board of trustees in my guru's organization. And in one gaming environment I got into with my husband, it was all male power gamers operating at a pretty high level. And I walked in as the only female. Realized, first of all, I really enjoyed dancing with those bulls. The second was, I could pretty much get whatever attention I wanted going in whatever direction, because these guys were grateful for the attention when it's positive. Now, if you get into serious arenas like high corporate stuff, I'm sure it's a very different genre. But as individuals, we want someone to meet us where we are. So I guess that's the answer I'm rambling toward, is to meet them where they are. And if those of us who do have the emotional and interpersonal skills can reach across and be the bridge, then that would be the avenue I would pursue.
It's interesting to me, the fact that requires bringing a lot of variables together. And that's, the flip side of the scatterbrained problem in the multifarious nature of feminine brain styles, which aren't confined to female bodies necessarily, but you can be distracted by the multifariousness. But the positive side of that is, if you can bring that together, then you essentially have an integrative structure where you can super coordinate a lot of variables and get a much richer output.
Ooh, I like the way you think, Layman. Yes. Now, that's not everybody's cup of tea, to deal with a fertile chaos. That's my term for it, a fertile chaos. And that is what we have in the world right now, where old structures are breaking down. New structures are only beginning to emerge. I think of it as a super saturated solution that's cooling down, an analogy from chemistry. And this is where, Jim Rutt's GameB, I think, is just really thrilling, because not everybody can function in an environment that's that chaotic. But that just happens to be contrarian that I am. I love those situations, and you get those because those are so creative when you get those little seeds of coherence, those little seeds of order that are in synchrony with the chemicals, with the materials in that mix. If you can set kind of like a seed of order, and then other parts of the chaos will tend to organize around it. That is very powerful. So when you bring these many different kinds of, I need a noun that's abstract enough, substances, factors, bringing them together and mixing together, you can create seeds of order. And I think that's partly how evolution happens. The emergence of new orders of complexity that never existed before tend to come out of these very chaotic situations. Now, I'm going to ramble a bit if you'll let me. We see this pattern all through from the beginning of the universe, 13.82 billion years ago, bang, suddenly there's all this kind of matter energy mushing around, and it coalesces into the matter and energy forms that we know. And then we've got suns, and now the suns are cooking up new chemicals, heavier chemicals. We have, and now, so we've got solid, liquid, gas, plasma, we've got planets, these physical, the realm of physics, the realm of the physical sciences. Things can exist for a long time, more or less going along as usual in their whatever dynamic equilibrium. But then there's a phase change, or let's just take a focused example. When a solid like ice melts into a liquid, this is called a phase change, that period where what has been a static thing, this block of ice, starts melting into a liquid. There's a period of great volatility. And then eventually everything's a liquid, and then there's a new period of stability. And maybe 100 years later, it gets hot enough that it all evaporates. You have a new period of intense volatility, then a new stable period. These periods of intense volatility, phase changes, that's the way it works in physics. Once we get the next whole level of complexity, biological life, wow, biological life somehow emerges out of this entropic universe. Wow, big magic. And then it evolves into systems of ever greater complexity. Biological evolution happens, I think the consensus is now in terms of punctuated equilibrium. There are periods of great stability where things more or less change. If they change slowly. And then there are periods where things change hugely, abruptly. Out of that, and those are the punctuation points in the punctuated equilibrium. And then out of this, if you're going to get it, you get a whole new ecosystems with entities of even greater complexity. And we've gone through a whole series of those in the biological life on this planet. Now, when we come to human societies, you see the same large pattern. You see societies, technologies, and they go along more hunter-gatherers. We were hunter-gatherers for nearly 200,000 years, and then something changes, and now we're farmers. And then something changes, and now we're ancient empires. And something changes, and now we're the medieval world, and now we're the modern world, and now we're the postmodern world. And you notice these changes happen faster and faster. That's another subject. In human society, we follow the same pattern as we did in the physical world, the world of the physical sciences, the world of the biological sciences. Same pattern in human society. These phase changes, these periods, the punctuation points in the punctuated equilibrium, we tend to experience them as dark ages, where the whole old order breaks down, the quality of life goes down. I mean, life gets really brutal for a lot of people, but then our whole next order of complexity emerges out of that fertile chaos. Well, folks, we're in one of those periods of a punctuated equilibrium right now. That's why everything's so chaotic. And this is my message. There is light at the end of the tunnel. The next new order is emerging. That's what you're about. That's what all of us in these metamodern, integral, and so on GameB circles are about, is helping bring in the next new order by creating what Jim Rett calls these islands of coherence. And I'm building on what on your leading question, Layman, because it's precisely around these kind of seeds, these little islands of new coherence that start to crystallize out of the supersaturated solution. And they have to be congruent with what's going on in that solution. It's not something you impose top down. And here's the big magic. This is how complex systems organize themselves bottom up. The big magic. How do we get ever ongoing evolution in an entropic universe? How do complex systems self-organize from the bottom up? Because it is a bottom-up process. Now, there are also top-down processes, but the big magic happens bottom-up, and that's how I see it. These little seeds of congruence in a supersaturated, chaotic solution, a fertile chaos, And that's what I see us doing in these communities that you and I like to hang out in. And I think it's thrilling. So I don't know, I may have wandered fairly far from where you started, but I'll stop there.
Well, if I put the previous conversation together with what you just said, I get a vision of the metaphorical role of masculine and feminine styles in that process, because there's a science and archetypally masculine styles of thinking have incorporated. Now, at first it seemed like a colonization, but now everything it's colonizing is repatterning itself. It's gone into areas that were previously regarded as yin or feminine areas, right? That complexity and bottom up and biology and non-controlled systems, intuition, all of that stuff is now becoming part of the scientific conversation.
Yes.
And at first that's very suspicious, but it means that a lot of things that we previously associated with the feminine are now repatterning what scientific rational thought means. So there's an enormous opportunity for the female to enter that conversation, and I think it puts us in a pretty good position for making something really amazing on the other side of this turbulent transition phase.
Agreed, and I think it is going to be amazing. I mean, everyone. If as a cultural historian, I can imagine myself back in the previous years, and in fact, that's what I'm doing in the integral novel I'm writing. The people who of a hunter in a hunter-gathering society. Let's imagine ourselves 50,000 years back. There's never been anything but hunter-gathering. Who could imagine if we tried to explain to them what the Roman Empire would be like? Say, take an ancient empire. How could you even explain to them? No more than you can explain to a baby that's getting born and is entering the birth canal. How can you explain to that baby what the world is going to be like that it's being born into? All that baby sees is it's in a dark passage. It's in incredible distress. It's leaving everything it knew. It's in pain. I mean, the contractions must be even more painful to the baby than the mother. And it's being pushed. It probably thinks it's dying. It's dying painfully. It doesn't know that it's in a tunnel.
Historically, a lot of them did die in that process.
Oh yeah, I mean, just not until we got to the modern world, like the last 100 years, did you expect to raise all the children? Did you expect your pregnancies to come to term, the baby to be born alive and live to grow up? And you're horribly upset when it doesn't? No, you go back more than 100 years, and you just expected to lose a few of them. I mean, yay for the modern world, yay for the postmodern world. But putting back is that baby's going to be born into a world that is much vaster than the comfortable womb that it knew until it outgrew the womb. It's getting kind of uncomfortable and kind of feeling kind of cramped, but that's the only world I know. Oh no, I'm dying in pain. Whoosh, suddenly there's a light at the end of the tunnel, right? Light at the end. People who are happy to greet me. I'm greeted by in this light that I've never known. Beings are greeting me, and they're happy to greet me. And I'm just kind of this helpless baby, but I've been born into a world that's much vaster than I could ever have imagined. If you could talk to that infant in the womb and it could understand you, it could never imagine the world it's about to be born into. And I take this as a very powerful metaphor for what we're going through right now. We're going through a dark passage from an old era that's breaking down all around us, and the horrible things that scream at us in our headlines, I see as the contractions that are pushing us through the tunnel. I mean, we can't go back. I mean, we may 30% of us want to. They're trying to. They're picking people like Donald Trump, because they want to go back to the imagined past. There's only one way. When we're embodied, time only flows in one direction. It may flow in more directions when we're out of our bodies, but when we're embodied, time flows in one direction. That's forward, and we've got a 13.82 billion year track record here of moving forward into structures of ever greater complexity that support consciousness of ever greater complexity. We've got, 13.82 billion years is a very big data set. I think we can draw some robust conclusions. We're in one of those periods of transition right now. There is a light at the end of the tunnel. And this gets back to the point you started with on this verbal is, I don't think some of us are trying to imagine how wonderful it could be, but you take some of the things that scare us the most, like nanotechnology, GMO foods, genetic modification. I mean, the possibilities that open before us are astonishing. And look how far we've come. I mean, why would evolution stop now? Why are we arrogant enough to think, oh, this is it, this is as far as it can go? No, there's going to be a next step, and we're witnessing it. And it's exciting to be with a group of people who are trying to actively kind of help midwife this and make it a better version of itself and avoid some of the pitfalls, because there are pitfalls. We will need our A game to pull this off. But I mean, so many exciting things are possible. And this is where my visionary side kind of goes, ooh, 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 let me at it.
We're going to need our A game if we're going to beat game A.
That's right.
We're
going to need our A game to manifest game B. Okay, we'll work on that one, Layman.
This transition, in order to midwife it properly, to make it workable and as graceful as possible, has to be done on multiple scales simultaneously.
Yes.
So there's something that has to go on nationally, right? We've got to tweak our governing structure. We've got to have some kind of new approach to how we run our legal system and our legislative system. We've also got to set up experimental enclaves of people trying to live and organize differently. We've also got to try to be different in our relationships with individuals.
Yes.
But we've also got to be different in our bodies, in our embodiment.
In our bodies,
an area where there's a real female insight, because like I was saying, we've done a lot of these podcast series. Most of the time it's pulling teeth to get women to come on, even if they're women we incredibly respect.
Really?
But as soon as we started doing a sexuality series, we had a half dozen women ready to go. That was a topic in which they had a fascination and a readiness to engage. I think because it's more immediate, more personal, more embodied, and they felt like it was an area in which more things got integrated for them.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, that's interesting to hear that they were. I'm not at all surprised to hear that they were ready to jump on the sexuality thing, but that they were reluctant in other arenas. That does surprise me a little bit. Interesting, but to take it back,
refusal. It's a reticence. They're they're slower to do it. They're more cautious. They're a little more suspicious. They don't jump forward the way the men do.
Okay. Well, I'll make a point here, and then I want to go back to what you said before that. I did go through graduate school in academia. I have a PhD in cultural history from Cal in the 70s. I mean, it was a brutal experience. It was a very hostile environment. I proved to myself that I could function in it, but that was competitive in a really unpleasant way. People are out. It was a gladiatorial ring, in an abstract way. And I can see why women would be reluctant to jump into those kinds of conversations where their experience is that they will be attacked and they have to defend themselves. You better be ready to be a gladiator. And, okay, I don't mind playing with the bulls. I've done it. I can do it. So, but I wanted to go back to what you said about having to move toward game B on all these different levels. And I said, yes, of course, because manifestation is fractal. That's one of my great insights, right? You're welcome to steal it. Manifestation is fractal. So any organization that we bring at any level is going to have ramifications at all the other scales. And so, yes, it is important to be working on all of them, but a really potent island of coherence on any one of them can radiate to other levels of scale. And I would add one to the list you said. I would just add intrapersonal, where we're working on ourselves. I mean, especially as we go forward into this new era, which is, to use Ken Wilber's terms, into teal and especially turquoise, which I think some of us are manifesting. We had better be doing our shadow work on ourselves, because we're getting into some of those arenas where some of the traditional levels, the animism, the everything is alive, it's coming back. and it's coming back an octave higher, to use the phrase. It's coming back on a meta level, and we had better be really in integrity with ourselves as we enter those subtle energies, to put it and to use one analogy, because the darkness in us will attract darkness out there. The light in us will attract light out there. The light out there will attract the light in us. Darkness out there will attract the dark in us. So we need to be working on all of these levels that you mentioned, plus our own interiors. And each one of us will tend to specialize and be more at home in one or the other. Like our mutual friend, Ryan Nakati, is really drawn to political system. Oh, I am totally behind him. That's his thing. Doesn't attract me. I'm so glad other good people are working on it. But anyway,
thank you for introducing the intrapersonal. That's where maybe most of my thinking goes when I'm by myself. Yeah. I think there's it's not out of the question to base spirituality on ontological structures in the universe, right? As if there's really some this and really some that to which we're relating. It's an open question in some areas, but you don't need to do that, right? You can have what I call a post-metaphysical spirituality, where you could take the relations of our interior subsystems and use that to basically regenerate all of the spiritual practices and spiritual experiences.
Agreed.
We don't have to do it that way, but it's available. You can be very agnostic about the structure of reality and still get the necessity and the opportunity and the insights and the practices of spirituality just from thinking about how the different quasi-autonomous interior systems operate together as a community. One thing, though, I was thinking of is the question. We touched on this a little bit. Like, it's unknown the degree to which we need to have more women in these spaces, right? Like today, people flatter themselves thinking that they're very inclusive, and so we think, oh, we should have more of each of the obvious categories showing up. Mm-hmm. And it's unknown. It seems like that's needed to some degree, but we don't want to force it. There's a question of what is representational fairness versus what is the minimum amount of diversity needed to get higher level collective intelligence. Right? Like, is it about fair representation, or is it about getting a smarter mix that doesn't get captured by some homogeneous perspective, conscious or unconscious?
Very interesting question, and we will have to live the answers by exploring. We all learn by doing anyway. The optimum result will probably be a mix, and we'll have to experiment to find out what it was. Like the kind of high octane nerds we were talking about earlier. There were these guys, the geniuses like Steve Jobs and Elon Musk. That will probably always be a mostly male. There will be maybe some females. I'm just guessing here. I don't know. There probably is some innate gender selectivity here. The key there, of course, will be to not discriminate, to not have any blockages for the rare men who have an innate gift for traditionally female preserves and vice versa. But once we get out of certain areas which may turn out to have some hardwired bias, we get into arenas like, say, running companies, where having a male-female balance may be a very good idea and worth aggressively pursuing, not in a way that blocks anybody, but in a way that actively encourages the underrepresented gender. My experience in working groups is that where you're really trying to achieve something material, whether it's organizational or product or some specific outcome that goes out into the broader world, my experience is that the closer you come to an equal gender balance, the better the working group is. Men tend to be brutal and women tend to be poisonous, in their dark sides. And when you get a group that's weighted to mostly women, the men tend to back off because the women can be pretty horrible in their way. When you get a group that's mostly men and very few of them, the women tend to back off because, the men, they're doing their gladiator games, right? And the women just, ooh. where, oh man, women can be horrible too. The mean girl syndrome. So, but as a mix, they tend to balance each other out. And that's just been my working experience. Other people, this is not a scientific, methodologically sound survey. So in terms of running corporations, I think the evidence, or even running nations, heads of state, I think the evidence is in women can do just as good a job as men, provided they are not having to hold the change diapers and do the dishes and do the laundry and so on at the same time. That I think will tend to level itself out fairly quickly. I hope so. And I think the change will happen faster than you said a while back, Layman, because one of the things I've noticed is that the punctuation points come faster and faster. And this is a pattern that goes all the way back to the Big Bang. Each next major emergence of a totally new order of complexity, each next one tends to happen an order of magnitude faster than the one before. And that pattern, you have to cherry pick your data a little bit, not that much. And that pattern holds through biological evolution on this planet, and it holds through the evolution of human societies to the next order of complexity. And I've charted the human ones on an Excel spreadsheet. And each next step up to the next order tends to come an order of magnitude faster. At this point, we have reached the stage where they're coming within a human lifetime. And I figure if it just keeps speeding up, one of the things about this Plan B the next world order that Plan B wants to take us to is the changes will just keep on coming, that the changes become normal. And that's going to be something new. That's a whole new fourth world order. That's even beyond human societies. I mean, the change we're going through now, Layman, this is not where you asked, but I'll say it. We've had three major, I don't want to call them chunks. We've had physics only, the physical universe. And then about 4 billion years ago on planet Earth, we started getting biological life. And that evolved faster, in orders of complexity faster and faster. And then we get human societies. And that's a whole different, so we've got these three tiers, if you want to call it, or three chunks, three very discrete chunks. We've got something different happening. Layman, we're going into a fourth tier. We're not just going into the next order of human society. We're going into a whole new fourth tier where we've got AI. I mean, we're going to be running our devices. We're going to be running our devices off our brainwaves. I mean, the research is already happening. I mean, we are wiring ourselves the way the world has wired itself because of the COVID pandemic. I mean this even literally. I see each human being, Homo sapiens, all 7.6 billion of us, as little brain cells, right? In embryology, when a fetus is developing in the womb for the first few months, it just grows more and more brain cells. But then you get to a certain point about midway through second trimester, where the number of brain cells stops increasing. The rate of increase slows down, but they start sending out dendrites and they start forming out synaptic connections. And you get enough of that. And there's a certain density of connectedness. There's a Goldilocks zone where if you have enough interconnectedness, you can get higher, you can get thought, what we do, we think, right? Homo sapiens, we're aware. We're aware that we're aware. If you have too many of those synapses, you get an epilepsy, you get chaos. If you have too few, nothing much happens, you get stasis. But there's this range of interconnectedness where higher thought becomes possible. And it doesn't, the specific pattern of connectedness doesn't matter. This is what gives me great hope for us. The specific pattern doesn't matter. It's the density of connectedness. And this is the bottom-up self-organizing aspect of it. We are wiring the planet. We Homo sapiens are becoming the prefrontal cortex for Gaia. This is happening as you and I sit here. I mean, Gaia is waking up. Our internet is the beginning of the stirrings of what happened with Homo sapiens back 200,000 years ago when we started getting our prefrontal cortexes and we started imagining getting symbols of meaning that had meaning. And then we started noticing patterns. and telling ourselves stories that made sense of the patterns. I mean, the planet's starting to do that through us. We are the planet's prefrontal cortex. This is like, ooh, now this is where my visionary side starts really getting excited. Okay, you know, I may be making all this up, but I'm having fun anyway.
Well, that's good stuff. Let's come back to the accelerationist argument in a moment. Touch maybe on one or two more things around gender and sexuality. It seems like in order to have the higher level insights necessary to navigate the transition, we need to be able to combine multiple types of perspectives.
Mm-hmm.
Since looking at male and female, you don't need 50-50 parity in every space,
That's
but you
right.
probably need enough so that both styles can realize a shape that they're speaking about in common from a different angle.
Okay.
And I went to a story in my own mind from the past. I lived in this house when I was younger, and we had a poetry night every week.
Ooh.
The poetry night, there were a couple of women and a couple of men, and the women, all of them, every time pretty much, they would say, oh, I don't know if this is a poem, but, and then they would read it. Right? And then I would write the poems, and I realized I don't know that either. Right? When I look at the poem and go, I don't know if this is a poem, what I say is, this is a poem. So I realized we were describing the exact same phenomenon with different language.
Yeah.
That allowed me to see what the phenomenon was with greater clarity. And I was only coming at it from a certain angle because the male brain is sort of simplified in the womb chemically, and it has this, it does an operation I call basically, right? And if you need to send people off to die, they have to be, well, basically that's enough. I'll just go and
basically,
and have to be able to forget about a whole bunch of things that are absolutely pertinent and just act as if it's okay to go forward not knowing anything.
Wow. Yeah, that touches is something I've noticed. Like, I've learned not to give my husband more than one thing to think about at a time. He's a very bright guy. He's a retired Kaiser physician, very high-powered gamer, yada yada. But don't give him more than one thing to think about at a time. If I say, "Oh, there's this and there's this," he's immediately off doing this. And I wonder if that correlates with the thing in the psychosocial spheres that men want to fix it. Women want a sympathetic ear. And the guys will go, oh, if I'm just kind of venting, oh boy, I had a just this and this. Oh, here's what you can do, or here's what I'll do. I say, no, I just want you to be here with me. And the women,
the men as a task-oriented subspecies, right? All the fetuses are female to begin with, and then the mothers do something to some of them that make them a little bit more narrow and more self-sacrificing in a certain way.
Yes.
They line up the tasks, right? The first task might almost overload you. If you get a second task, that's probably as much as you can handle. You got to take care of the first one first because the tunnel is narrow. And if you hear about a whole bunch of things, unless you're remembering the task of listening, then it's very difficult. I mean, it took me a long time to be able to realize that about myself and say to a woman in conversation, I'm full right now. I can't hear the next thing.
Yeah.
You go, I can do these things. I can go up to this point, but if it goes too far, I'm probably going to start manifesting in erratic ways. And that's because I care about these things and absolutely can't process them in this fashion.
Yeah. I was thinking while you were explaining that redneck comedian said, "Get her done." The men are biologically conditioned to get her done. And I'm thinking of ancient Greek heroes, the war epics. You better be one-pointed focused.
Sure.
And not when you charge into battle with your spear. Yeah, and look at what you guys have achieved. I mean, it's magnificent. But then we're collecting the acorns and grinding them into mush and taking care of the baby and making sure the toddler doesn't run off into the bushes where the viper nest is. And we're multitasking.
They need each other, those two styles. Even if you think of a transgendered unisex species, they still are going to need both of those specializations to complement each other somehow, because the danger on one side is I'm tracking so many things, I just don't know what to do. I don't get anything done because I don't know how to prioritize. The other side is, hey, I totally know how to prioritize. Just don't think about all those things. But when you do that, you miss a ton of relevant stuff, and you're going to fuck up a whole bunch of tasks because of the things you didn't take into account.
Right. And I was thinking the kind of extreme male genius nerds tend to be not so good at, shall we say, tend to be not so good at human relationships.
Well, yeah, some of them. It would be interesting
Some of them.
to divide them into the ones that are and the ones that aren't, and look for
Yeah,
what patterns might be.
yeah. Yeah, but yeah, vive la différence. I mean, you need differences in order to have any kind of energy flow. You need to have areas of higher concentration and areas of lower concentration to get an energy flow. Otherwise, you have a stasis, you have nothing. I mean, manifestation manifests in terms of dualities, a North Pole, a South Pole. You get a magnetic energy flow, something starts happening. Vive la différence.
So looking at your big picture, it definitely seems like there's some acceleration in the rate of these changes. Definitely seems like we're at a place where we're not just debating whether or not the United States should have universal health care or not. We're looking at a situation where the very structure of matter and biology has been hacked, and that's racing forward. Yes. So there's something of cosmic significance, right? That
yes.
Matter has begun to change itself. You open the news and it says, hey, we made a new element. And you're like, what?
Again, for the umpteenth time.
That's of cosmic significance that new elements are being made.
Yeah, the suns can't do it anymore, so we took over.
So that's definitely racing ahead. And I think one of the danger would be getting the level of the connectivity right, because here's what would terrify me, that the incentives of the current regulated marketplace are such that connectivity will be installed so widely and so in excess of what we need that you get the epileptic effect rather than the upgrade effect, because there is a structure that says just do it all and who cares about the consequences, and nobody's taking care to make sure the individual units are protected from too much connectivity or information overloads and things like that. And if everybody's wired together, it only takes a little disruption to bring the whole thing down.
But those islands of coherence, that's what will pull us forward. There's going to be a lot of destruction. And this is where I'm thinking, now that we are conscious, some of us are conscious of going through this, maybe we can mitigate some of the suffering. But my hope here, and I have the same concern, where I, as a cultural historian, see a hopeful pattern, is that at every one of Homo sapiens' next steps up, there has come a whole train of unforeseen consequences, along with the new, and it tends to come with a new communication technology. It tends to come with new technology like farming, beer. Along with farming comes beer. Suddenly you've got enough grain that you can make beer. You can have a frat party every week. Alcoholism. I mean, this is what my novel is about, is that transition from foraging to the very first farming communities. And beer, you've got to have some strong conventions. There are always going to be some individuals to this day who cannot handle it, who live their lives as alcoholics. It's tragic. It's tragic for them, for the people close to them. But at that level, as I imagine it, this was like, no, this is the end of everything. We can't handle this. So that is part of that period of instability and transition as we wrestle with these new, technologies, whatever the new thing is that we're not equipped to handle. Some people will end up handling it. Some people never will. We still have a massive problem with alcoholism. It hasn't kept us from going up the next 4 levels. We're still living with it. I expect, why would evolution stop with us? Part of the period of great volatility is going to be dealing with precisely those issues you named. And some of those islands of coherence will break down, but some will bear fruit and end up seeding, crystallizing out the next world order that will stabilize eventually. Some individuals will never, or groups will never be able to handle it, and they'll stay caught in their neuroses, their addictions, whatever it is. But in aggregate, the society will stabilize around the new structures. And I'm calling on the past to say, we have a track record of doing this. We've done it 6 times before as Homo sapiens. We can do it a 7th time too. That's my rally. We can do this. Let's get her done.
Yes, we can.
Yes, we can. Yeah, we can do it. Get her done.
When I was a kid, I read a lot of Terence McKenna, a psychedelic philosopher, but also one of the first, mid 20th century advocates of an accelerationist model of the future.
Mm.
And he was very interested in a radical intermingling of novelty and habit that was coming faster and faster over the course of history.
He saw that, yeah.
Side effect of that would be the individual and cultural sense of extraordinary mass peculiarity as this intensified. He thought that the psychedelic experience gave some people a sort of foreknowledge of what that would be like, but
Sure.
that as these things change faster and faster, and as they change within the course of a single lifetime, we are no longer biologically prepared to handle that rate of change, and things are going to seem very uncanny, very strange, and that this is traumatic if you can't handle it. If you're not prepared to surf the intensive peculiarity, then it's going to hit you like a trauma-inducing factor. And that seems to have been the case, almost the definition of what 2020 was.
Yeah.
There were a lot of terrible things, and there were some good things. But the thing they all seemed to have in common was a sense of mass uncanniness. And if that effect continues to intensify, we have to personally and interpersonally develop the skills we need in order to work with strangeness, because we're not going to be adapted to it in the sense that things are familiar, right? Evolution prepared us to a rock, a hammer, marriage. We're pretty good on that. We've been practicing for a long time. Seems very familiar, but more and more we're going to be facing something that seems like disruption, unfamiliarity, peculiarity, strange juxtapositions are going to emerge out of this connectedness. I'm just wondering what your take is on the eonic future of weirdness and how we handle that.
Yes, and no, it's a very real concern. So several different directions I could go with this. Yes, I want to come back to the LSD, the psychedelic thing, but I've watched this. I've watched my nephews grow up, and one of them was a digital native. One of them wasn't. One of them, they're 10 years apart in age. I swear their brains are wired differently. I'm not able to spend a whole lot of time around young people. It's just isn't the way my life runs. But I think we, the TV generation, I think our brains were wired slightly differently because we watched TV before we were 5 years old. That affected brain formation. When children are born and just try, as soon as they can move under their own steam, try to keep them off your devices. They take to it like they are extensions of their nervous system. And the technological advances are coming so fast. Television was new when I was born. It was still pretty new. And then came the internet and, email, and then we got smartphones, and every next generation, and it's coming faster than generations now. The babies who are born into this world get wired for it in their first 5 years. It will not be so strange to the people coming up behind us as it is to you and me. It's probably less strange to you than it is to me. I have to really struggle with some of the IT, and I was a power user 30 years ago, and I feel lost now. And the changes are going to keep coming faster. Now, here's the big difference, and then I want to come back to the LSD, the psychedelic. I see us becoming transhuman. We are, okay, I'm going to tell a little story here. When the horseless carriage was first invented, you've got this engine. You don't need a horse anymore. You can run your buggy along on your petrol-powered engine. But for the very first ones, if it was after dark and you absolutely had to go somewhere, you had someone walking ahead of you with a kerosene lantern. Well, very soon they started making the horseless buggies with these little kind of hooks at the very front, each side of the fender, where you could hang 2 kerosene lanterns. Very soon after that, they started incorporating the kerosene lantern into the body of the front of the car. And then once they started wiring them with electrical systems, they can, you get the headlights. And now the headlights are wired in with the rest of this, certain automatic things happens. And I've seen a series of pictures. I'm not sure I could find it again, but the evolution of the headlight. There's a series of 10 discrete steps where something that started out being a completely separate item gets slowly incorporated into the body and the metabolic functioning of the mechanism. This is what we're going to be doing with our devices. These are already extensions of our nervous system. We are going to be incorporating them. I mean, we are becoming transhuman. We're going to become a different species. And this is what gets really scary, that I think, okay, why not? The universe seems to be doing this. I mean, the universe is in charge. We're not. We do the best we can from our side. We're part of the bottom up here. There are some top-down things happening, and this is the world's religions and spiritual practices talk about those. We connect with them as best we can with what we've got, with the firepower we've got. But let's face it, we're bottom up here. We are going to keep on evolving whether we want to or not. We are becoming, so my partial answer to you is we are becoming transhuman. We may become a number of species. We will not be limited to our current neural wetware. We will be augmenting it and subsuming it. AI will not supplant us. Here's my answer to people who are worried about it. Elon Musk, if you're listening, AI will not supplant us. We will subsume AI into us, ourselves, and we will evolve into something beyond Homo sapiens. Now that's scary enough. We really want our A game plan B for that. I think it's exciting. I mean, wow, you can really go some fun science fiction places with that. But already, just to bring it back to slightly more grounded, I'm going to be the female here and get slightly more grounded. Gosh, now my train of thought escaped me. Okay, here we go. We are already evolution on the planet. Homo sapiens, as we are now, we are evolution on this planet, whether we like it or not. And I'm going to quote Stuart Brand here. He created the Whole Earth Catalog back in 1968. At that time, he said, we are as gods. We might as well get good at it. Now he's out there very urgently saying, we are gods. We better get good at it. We are evolution, whether we like it or not. We cannot put that genie back in the bottle. So, I mean, okay, so that's one step forward. I mean, we're stuck with it. We're stuck with it. I mean, kind of here we are, and we got to learn to cope. And we will rise to the occasion like we've risen to it so many times before in our history and prehistory. But this is why I'm excited about GameB and groups like that, because we need to get real and grapple with this.
One of the things that concerns me is how we integrate the conservative spirit. Because I'm, one of the things I'm primarily a religion and spirituality guy, but I've ended up participating in and presiding over a lot of integral political spaces. One of the, I think the neatest, the 0 point of integral politics is to tease apart left, right from developmental operating systems.
Yes.
It's very easy to conflate postmodernism with the left and conservatism with Republicans or things like that. But actually, you can go down every human stage and perhaps even pre-human, because every part of the universe has to partly preserve its structure and partly overcome its own structure in order to participate in the cosmos. So it's at all these levels. And as a species, it's very useful to have half of the people, very much like the male-female divide, half of the people should be ready to adopt new ideas they've heard about and get on board with that program. And half of the people should say, whoa, let's not do that too fast. That's untried. And you don't know all of the complex intelligence heuristics that are inherited by our current behavior. So we have a gas pedal and a brake, very useful.
Yes.
Been very useful over history. You wouldn't want it to go in either of those directions entirely. But if we're at a point where the changes are happening within a lifetime, then it becomes very hard for the conservatives to say anything useful, right? That there's a point at which putting the brakes on causes the thing to shudder and go off the road. If it's happening so fast, how do we incorporate them? How do we, if they say, well, let's slow down and not really integrate this until 3 generations have passed, is a lot of their motivation.
Yes.
But we don't have 3 generations. We might have a decade to make a new change in a certain area.
Yeah.
So then what's their place then, you know?
Ah.
They're there and there's millions of them. They're a huge
Yes.
force, but they're now speaking in a way that doesn't make sense with the current rate of change.
Yes.
What's their role going forward? Because if they're not on board, they're going to cause trouble.
Yes, excellent question. And I do actually have an answer for that, but I want to take a little bit of time getting there. Yes, the thing about the traditionalists, the conservatives, the pre-modern mindset, and that's a very specific stage in the Wilber and other developmental stages. When I was a graduate student, I spent 2.5 years living in Germany, working on my dissertation. I hung out with a bunch of Germans. I remember this one German graduate student. We were, in the student party, drinking beer, eating sausage. That's what they did in Bavaria back then. And this one Bavarian explained to me, jolly, I said, it's not that we Bavarians are conservative, you understand. And I have to interpolate here. The Bavarians are the Texans of Germany. They're very religious conservative if you get out in the countrysides, even in the cities. At least that was 40 years ago. He said, it's not that we Bavarians are conservative, you understand. It's just that we like to chew over a new idea for 2 or 3 generations before we accept it. Ho, ho, ho. And everybody went ho, 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 and took another drink. Yes, the value. Every one of those stages has a core value and a core essence. And one of the useful but limited metaphors for this is rungs on a ladder. And the problem with them, the ladder metaphor, is that some are lower and some are higher. All are valuable, all are essential to the structural integrity of the entirety. Everyone has an essential function to perform at every level. The essential value I see in that 1/3 of our population that is conservative traditionalists. Moral fiber. This is this is part of what I've charted on my Excel spreadsheet. The new emergent value system at the level of the traditional, pre-modern, you could call it medieval mindset, is morals. The 10 Commandments handed to Moses in stone. And this is a moral law. At that level, when we have reached that level, collectively, we intuit that there is a moral law that applies to everybody. And this is kind of like an externalization, a formalization of what we had all along as very social beings. We were, when we were pre-human, we were tribes, we were clans, we were almost a hive mind. I think we didn't really imagine ourselves as individuals. We were part of this collective, and we thought more collectively than individually. Intensely social, you are part of this group, and that is your life and your context, and you are dedicated to your group. Well, as we start to go up the structures as Homo sapiens, individually and collectively, when we reach that level, this is the axial age, where we start getting the monotheistic religions. There is this, we start to concretize, it's not the best term, but we start to put forth this deep intuition that there are moral laws that apply to everybody who's an usin. There are themins, and they don't count. But usins, there are ways we behave toward each other. There are ways we are in ourselves. And I call it a good old-fashioned term, moral fiber. 10 Commandments on a stone tablet, handed down from on high by the deity. This is absolute, right? It's absolute. So this ramble is by way of getting to my specific answer to your specific question. We need the values, the collective moral values. We need a collective moral code, moral fiber. And it's not just for how we are with each other. It's also intrapersonal, things like persistence, courage, loyalty, honesty, whatever our group defines as the collective moral code. We need moral fiber or we fall apart. The vessels cannot contain the spirit unless they're reinforced by the fiber. And I like the concept of Adobe those incredible adobe structures built around the world by the agricultural societies. Well, you trample straw into the clay, you trample it in, and then you let it harden into bricks. And that straw is the fiber that gives the bricks much greater strength and durability. That's my metaphor for moral fiber, the good moral virtues. And that there is your answer. That is the value, the essential value that these people hold for us all. What they need, what we need to do for them from our, post-modern, meta-modern level, is try to construct a social container in which they feel safe enough to be a healthy version of who they really are. They are so threatened. They are in such distress and despair that they have bloody chosen Donald Trump as their champion, and he's defective. I'm using Ken Wilber's terms. He's a stage below them, and he's a defective one at that. They are in such distress that they have chosen him as their champion. We need to do better by them, and that's one of the jobs some of us, people like our friend Ryan Nakade, are working on. It's urgent. Because
that's great. When I was a kid, one of my favorite movies was a Mel Brooks movie called History of the World Part 1. And there's a great sequence, the Jewish history sequence, where Moses comes down from the mountain. He's got 3 tablets, and he says, I have here these 15. And then he steps and he drops one and it shatters. And he's like, 10 commandments? So ever since I was a kid, I thought about, what was on that other tablet.
What were the other 5?
You have a set of these reified amber blue pre-modern customs.
Yes.
But then there's either a sense that there's missing information in the background that they don't really know, and that we're going to use these as a rule of thumb. But there's other amber blue systems in which they are very absolutistic about those rules.
Absolutistic is amber blue.
Think into like what's a healthy pre-modern versus an unhealthy pre-modern, because sometimes you meet people who are very religious, very hierarchical, very folksy, very traditional, and yet they're very open, they're very relaxed, they're very human. But the thing we've been seeing lately is sort of an agitated, diseased kind of pathological form, like you say, picking a bad shepherd for the herd in the Donald Trump character. And is there something, this is an argument you hear on the left to some degree, right? What's the role of modern systems in destroying pre-modern systems or toxifying them? In the sense that if a modern conglomerate buys up all the crops and wants to implement its new ideas, it disrupts the world space in which those people could grow and thrive naturally. So they are dispossessed, alienated, agitated, constantly confronted by things that don't make sense. It's very hard for them to be a good version of themselves.
Yes.
So, what do you think makes the difference between the conditions for healthy versus unhealthy pre-modern, or in general? What's the difference between health and unhealth at a level, at an operating system, in a world space?
Okay, just off the top of my head, feeling safe enough to just go about your daily business. And how do we make these people feel safe? I don't know. Now, I will amplify, I want to underscore what you said. I'm fortunate enough to know a number of people who are traditionalists, and my husband's cousins and the brother of a friend of mine who's disabled, we help take care of her, who are very traditionalists, and they are some of the most decent people I have ever met. And they're in communities of they really live the good virtues. If you were raising children, you would want them in your PTA. You'd want their kids going to school with your kids. They are some of the most decent, nice, wonderful people you will ever meet. And these people all voted for Donald Trump. We just don't talk about it. But I've loved the times we've gotten together with them. I just love them as they're wonderful human beings. How do we make this group feel safe enough? Now, here's one of the problems with each of the first 6 stages that we are only now just starting to grow out of. Each one of those sees their values as absolute. And here's the trick. As we go up from one stage to the next, it's not so much that the values and everything we believed and knew at the previous stages was wrong. It's a smaller piece of a bigger picture, and Ken Wilber has had a lot to say about this. True but partial. The problem is that if you are at that amber blue stage, your religion is absolute. This is God on high. He has handed down those 10 commandments on a stone tablet, and people are still trying to put those tablets in stone in front of county courthouses. And they will vote for anybody who champions leaving them there, no matter what that individual is like. This is absolute. And this gets into the equation that Ken Wilber makes with the stages of human culture equating with Piaget's stages of cognitive development. These stages of individual cognitive development are capacities for abstract thought. To somebody who is solidly at amber blue, which is the traditional pre-modern mindset, your values, your religion is absolute. Your God is absolute. Your dogma, if you're a Catholic, the Nicene Creed, I believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of any. This is absolute truth. Anything that deviates from that is heresy. You go to hell for it. The ability to see that these are relative, not absolute truths. The ability to see that there's a larger context. That's when you are already starting to move up to the next, into the modern mindset where you say, well, what's your evidence? So and at every stage, the core values are absolute until you get individually to the point where you're starting to say, well, there's a larger context. That's one way to put it. Where what I always thought was the absolute turns out to be relative, still true, but relatively true. There's a larger context. And then you go up yet another level. Now, when is an individual or a culture ready to make that move? When is a snake ready to shed its skin? If you try to help a snake shed its skin before it's ready, you're just going to hurt or kill the snake. The snake has to grow internally to the point where it's ready. How do we help people at these other levels feel safe enough just to be who they are and climb down from their toxic side? When one of the challenges is that they are not cognitively at a level of sophistication where they can see that their truths are relative rather than absolute. Given that, how do we make them feel safe enough that they can be themselves and contribute the essence that they have to contribute? I don't have an answer for that. But that's something to work toward.
Yeah, it seems to me that we're a little bit held back by our emphasis on a narrow idea of cognitive development, because I was lucky enough to grow up in a rural farming and fishing community populated by hippies and pre-modernists, and they had a lot in common. They'd all gone back to the land. They all valued the land. They had to get things done, right? And dealing with them, some of them were very open, some of them were not, right? So the absolutistic ideation that they had meant something very different coming from one and coming from another, so that a person could say, yes, of course, the book is the book, the way is the way, this is how you have to be, otherwise you're going to burn in hell. But one of them just tells you that and then invites you in for coffee, and they're a little bit sad that you're going to hell, but they're not too worried about it. The next one is angry, anxious, wants to convert you, is willing to do harm to you based on their absolutism. Yes. So their cognitive capacity is something a little bit different from how they manifest it in the world.
Yes.
Now, when they feel safe, when their bodies are pretty healthy, when they came from homes where they didn't have to be contracted and reactive and in malnourishment and scarcity conditions, then they had a pretty laid back, very humanly understandable way of being absolutist versus a kind of terrorist model of absolutism.
Yes. Yeah, and now what the way I translate that in my mind is that somebody who is hell-bent to grab me and convert me, I see someone who's not entirely sure. They're really trying to convince themselves, and they're projecting it. So that's my
every fundamentalist is actually not quite convinced.
The ones who are out there trying to grab other people and force them to believe, they're really trying to convince themselves. There's some doubt that's my kind of offhand, inadequate answer. But the problem of feeling safe is actually a bigger one, because when you're in one of these absolutistic mindsets, which amber orange, the traditionalists, the conservative traditionalists are, you have to believe that that's the way the world is, or at least your world. And here in the, now I'm going to take just the United States, because this is a problem globally. Our version, our flavor here in the United States is there have always been several strands here. The traditionalist conservatives, who are about maybe a third of the population now, I mean, they used to be the majority, and they think of themselves as the majority. They have kind of a parallel, slightly alternate version of what the United States is to people, modernists and postmodernists like you and me. The United States is a set of how we function. You know, the Constitution is our operating system. It's a set of values. It's, you know, the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence. This is what the United States is. You know, the separation of powers, you know, separation of church and state, very, very important. That's not the America that the traditionalists have always lived in. They have a different, the Pilgrims, the founding, the Pilgrims, and then there was the Great Awakening of the 1740s and the Great Awakening of the 1840s. They homeschool, they send their kids to their own colleges, to their, they get college educations and so on, but their America is closer, and this is unfair to them, but it's closer to a blood and soil nationalism than it is to the kind of patriotism you and I have. I mean, this is the United States. This is God's country. This is this is Christian. This is the way it is. This is the way it's founded. This is God's rule. And this is where you get into some of those weirder evangelist prophecies around Donald Trump. I mean, that's kind of an extreme thing that makes the news because it's so sensational. But the core is that their sense of who they are and who this country is eroding, because they realize not only are they no longer the majority, they are at risk of, they're not the plurality, and that they're being swamped by the diversity. And it's not just racism, although racism is one of the strands. It's that we have assumed all along from the founding of this nation that we know what the nation is, and we know who we are and who this is, and this is God's will. This is what God wants, one nation under God, and we're seeing it dissolve in front of our eyes. The nation that our children will live in, and our children's children, is not going to be this, it's going to be something else, and that means that it's all going to hell. They're existentially terrified, not just individually unsafe, but existentially as who they thought they were and who they thought we all are. That's eroding before their eyes. How do we create a container in which they can feel safe? Because they are protected. This nation was founded on freedom of religion. They are free to be who they are.
You mentioned the, the dictum of trying to deal with someone you completely disagree with by loving them. And I think that's a big part of it. And I get that a little bit from my childhood background, is the ability to be emotionally and empathically supportive of these people, regardless of disagreements with the output of their cognition.
Yeah, but the first thing she said was meet them where they are and fall in love with them. Yeah. And that's the challenge. Now, I'm an INFJ on the Myers-Briggs scale. I'm an intuitive empath. That is something I do fairly naturally. Plus, I've studied in the cultural historian, so I have a lot of data with which to imagine myself in somebody else's shoes. Plus, I just kind of get on their wavelength. So that's part of my job as I see it, although I will kind of contribute to what Ryan's doing. I mean, my main job is to write my fiction and try to get this vision of a positive world out into a larger public via entertaining fiction. That's my dharma. But side by side with that, I also want to contribute to what people like Ryan are doing by reaching out to people in these communities, really understand, not trying to tell them, not trying to change their minds, not trying to change them, not trying to help them grow to the next level. That's an aggression. That's a pretty vicious aggression. Meet them as they are, really understand them. And
modernity has given us many incredible things and continues to be a very powerful operating system. Yeah. But in order to go a level past it, or 2 or 3 levels past it, we have to do something to get around its seemingly complete and mysterious dominance over all the processes. Right, whereby it's sabotaging the pre-modern and holding the postmodern back And that together creates a big problem for the postmodernists who want to set that whole structure free to move forward. And right there, I see many, but two in particular come to mind, problems with the way modernity is currently operating. One of them is failure to include and validate the pre-modern. Like Einstein's model of gravity is a level up from Newton because it explains why Newton was correct in his zone.
Yes.
And if modernity doesn't go to pre-modernity and say, here's why you're right,
yes,
then it's not really modernity yet. It hasn't stabilized as the next level. So that's one of the problems. Another problem is the current modern education system is to some degree false, doesn't really regenerate the skills of modernity. Tells you when you say the world is round because that's the modern consensus and the experts say so, and you have to replicate that on the test, you're essentially educating them in a pre-modern fashion. You're not giving them the practical skills to create modernity. You're saying, believe this because authorities say so. And so they are taking their modernity on in a pre-modern fashion. So while you have all these pre-modern colleges and communities, you also have a whole bunch of modern institutions that are subliminally full of people who are behaving in a pre-modern mode, even though they are articulating modern truths. They're not very far away from the pre-modern because the education system never really brought them to modernity. It just asked them to regurgitate modernity's conclusions.
Okay, quickly on your second point, because I really want to get back to your first one.
Yeah.
Agreed about education. However, caveat, I think we do a better job in the United States of teaching kids to think for themselves than in many other countries. You take China and its total regurgitation. Let's face it, our modern education system was created to train workers to work in assembly lines.
Sure.
I mean, our education is an assembly line. That has to change, and there are a lot of good people working on it. Back to your previous point, could you recapitulate for a minute?
It was about the legitimacy of a level is based on its ability to revalidate the previous level. So
Got it.
modernity has to say why pre-modernity was correct, as Einstein did to Newton.
Got it. Here's the issue with that, as I see it, is that the 6 levels of Ken Wilber's first tier, from first Homo sapiens up through post-modernity, it chunks down into 6 stages. Each one of those, individually and collectively, as we get ready to move from one stage to the next stage up, in all of these so-called, what I call first tier, all 6 of them, we tend to do it by demonizing the one we're pushing away from.
Right.
This has been the mechanism all through the first tier. And this, I hope, changes as we move forward because we are more aware of the process now. I hope we can do it without that. But it's just like somebody who has been an alcoholic or whose tendency and who's overcome it, some of them end up being crusaders against demon rum. You tend to demonize what you are outgrowing. And Ken Wilber has a lot to say about this. I mean, he has this wonderful thing in Up from Eden. The God of one level tends to become the devil of the next level up. And this is just something we do. We push off from it. We disidentify from it. And this is a place where Ken Wilber loves to quote Robert Keegan. The subject of one stage becomes the object of the subject of the next stage. As we go up the cognitive tiers, we end up disidentifying from something that we are identified with, where we can the previous truth becomes relative at best. And I love the example you gave of Newton and Einstein. That's one of my favorite examples. When Einstein came forth with the theories of relativity, force did not stop equaling mass times acceleration. It wasn't that Newton was wrong. It's just Newton remained as true as ever, essentially. I mean, look what we've done with Newton's equations. Wow. It's just there is a larger context. And this is what I hope we take with us as we go further in further tiers, is there is always a larger context, that we are able to stop absolutizing what we are sure of. that remember to be humble about it. Now, this is an issue with all of first year because these are real levels of cognitive sophistication, Piaget's levels of individual cognitive development. These are real. I mean, just like our neurological structure is real. We don't go from being babes in arms to riding a bicycle to learning to walk. There's a developmental sequence here. There is a developmental sequence in cognitive sophistication. I don't think we can ask or expect anybody in any of first year to take what they think their absolute truths are and see, well, maybe, I actually think modern would be more open to it than postmodern, to tell the truth. So how can we, I guess we have to be the examples, to be the change we want to see in the world, to have each level refrain from demonizing that which it is moving beyond. Of course, the modern tended to demonize the pre-modern. Of course, the postmodern demonizes the modern. We need to stop demonizing each other.
There's a balance there, because on the one hand, it's completely natural. When you're climbing the ladder, you have to push down on the rung you're on to go to the next rung. Go up. Yes. Right. So there's an allergy and a need to differentiate yourself from what went before. Yes. And in early levels of the so-called second tier, there's a lot of unnecessary and reactive critique of green among introdelites, so to speak, right? And so those next stages, when you go from teal, yellow to turquoise, you can relax about it a little bit. Yeah. And say, okay, maybe we've been demonizing it, and maybe we need to go back to all those first six and help them not demonize, because we're looking for the healthy versus the contingently pathological version of each of them, so they can work together. Exactly. So we're trying to do that. We're trying to empathize with all of them. And even in ourselves, we're trying to break down any of our resistances to first tier stages. But on the other hand, there's also a battle to fight, right? And we have to be very ready to tactically deploy vigorous critiques, especially against existing power structures that only understand power negotiations and are currently putting a brake on the whole development. So when I look at postmodernism, the first thing I see is it's barely started. Right, what we see in America over the last couple decades is probably not a representative sample of what that value stage is actually trying to do. It needs 500 years and 50 different variations for us to get a sense of what it really is. And we want to say to it, whoa, you're neglecting the values of the modern and the pre-modern stages. But we also need to say to you, you're also bringing forward criticisms that from our second tier perspective are true, because the modern system has most of the institutional power and is currently the brake on the forward motion. It's allowing in a lot of the cultural complaints of postmodernism, but it hasn't allowed in very many of the structural or economic or really the legal transformations that healthy postmodernism has been suggesting. Mm-hmm. So one example of the way we have to negotiate between unlearning our reactivity to previous stages, but also capitalizing on that as tactical, critical insight about how to play the game that they're playing in order to move beyond them.
Yes, and I would see, as far as your specific concern with modernity, the power structures of modernity, is a bit of reshifting of the incentives, specifically money incentives, will go a long way. To back out, moving to the side I'm more comfortable with, which is personal development, what gives me hope regarding this dynamic that you've just described is, I go back to Piaget's stages of cognitive development in individuals. All of us individually come up through all of those phases of human culture. We start as just helpless, and then we become little animists. There's a spirit in every rock and tree and bend in the river. Step on a crack, break your mother's back. At age 3, we're all little animists. At age hunter-gatherers. At age 5 or 6, we're all little barbarians. The boys go from watching Barney to be fascinated by T-Rex. We go at age 7, Piaget's formal operational systems come online. Formal operational, we start. That's where you start taking on the ability to see from another person's point of view. roles, rules, the 7 commandments. That's when they start catechism in Catholicism. That's where you start functioning, where your role in society and what the rules are, a very specific cognitive stage. We naturally grow through these levels. And then as when we go through puberty, we start thinking for ourselves, well, why should I do what you tell me to do? What's your evidence? That's the equivalent of what's your evidence? And some of us now, in earlier parts of history, going up through higher phases was optional. But what gives me hope here, Layman, and why I'm going to this analogy in answer to the question you posed, is that when there are people functioning at those higher levels all around you, we just grow up very naturally through the levels. We just mature into the next, and we mature into the next, and we mature into the next. We don't have to go through the conniptions of demonizing the previous stage. It's just the most natural thing in the world to go from one to the next, to the next, to the next. Now, and this is where I'm going to go back to Plan B and islands of coherence. I mean, this is just embryonic here. Maybe I'll come back to postmodern, the worldview that has been the leading edge from basically the end of World War II until now. That becomes the leading edge when it becomes a culture-wide and not just a few outliers. That has an upward pull, a strange attractor, as you will. And here's where I go back to Ken Wilber, who is one of the great geniuses. I mean, I'm steeped in Ken Wilber. I mean, I think he's up there with Kant and Plato, and maybe even outdoes them. But he postulates, he states, he asserts, he's a guy, he's out there with it. He asserts that every next stage of collective development is 10 times more powerful than the one before it. And I think there's something to it. I mean, it may not be exactly 10 times. That's a very handy, rememberable number. But each one of these is a way we can, it's a next step up in cognitive sophistication. We see patterns at a more abstract level, and we can make meaning out of them. I mean, look what we did with force times mass equals acceleration, as opposed to, God divided the heavens from the earth. I mean, back when, 3,000 years ago, that was a very powerful story. God created the creation in 7 days. That brought people together and made them able to work together in certain ways. Well, so this is by way of saying, yes, I do agree with Ken Wilber. Each next kind of collective operating system up is 10 times more powerful than the one before, because it is that much more powerful in observing, acting in effective ways. So this is why there is hope. This is why, even though the forces of inertia will put on the brakes, there are also those wedges that poke through, and as more and more islands of coherence emerge at the next level up, that will operate as a powerful attractor to slowly move the more and more masses up. I mean, we've still got people at the Barbarian. There's 5% of the American population is at the Donald Trump level of the Red Barbarian. 30 to 35% is pre-modern traditional. Maybe, I don't know, 40, 50%, 40% is modern, and a smaller amount is postmodern. But that postmodern is very powerful. It's kind of pulling the whole thing up. The ideals, the beautiful ideals of the postmodern world, a truly just social system where everybody has a decent, at least a minimally decent life. What a beautiful ideal. And I know some of the specifics are pretty caca, but that's been pulling us up. I mean, the kinds of interventions we do that nobody would have thought about 200 years ago. I mean, the awareness, I mean, I'm rambling now. I mean, who even thought of child abuse when I was a child? I mean, those, the kinds of interventions we do individually and collectively, we've come a long way. It may not look like it, and I don't see why it's going to stop. So I think that's enough of a ramble. I think I've made my point.
Yeah, the child abuse thing is interesting. When I think of my parents' generation, which is sort of your generation, I see them holding back an enormous number of things from the past that they decided they didn't want to pass on. It's still some of it got through, right? You could see these reactions in them where they used to get hit, and then it's there in them to do it, and they're struggling not to. They're creating this future space, and they're becoming more future oriented, which is very beautiful. But
well, in my generation, we got hit. But yeah, go ahead.
exactly. In my generation, we got threatened with being hit. We didn't get hit, and our kids we're just having a hilarious conversation with them about how people used to get hit.
Yeah. And when I saw some of my people who are the age of grandkids, if I had grandkids who are having kids, how they are with their babies and toddlers. I mean, they are so much farther along with we were. You know, the toddlers and the 2 and 3-year-olds start to get, aggressive in negative ways. The parents just intervene so smoothly and just gently put them on another path. And it's like you just give them something, a shinier toy, just something that attracts their attention and gets the kids all interacting happily with each other. They're creating positive, synapses.
It's very easy to fear that we're losing some of the strength that the hard attitudes gave us in the past, but it seems like it's made up for in the sophistication and nuance that's
Agreed.
deployed on a very widespread scale, at least in the very privileged parts of the world right now. Now, when you were previously speaking, I thought a lot about education, because that's how you set up a situation in which the upcoming people who are moving through these levels understand what the target level is that they're trying to adapt to.
Mm-hmm.
And it has to be a very deep education, because 10 times more powerful is 10 times as dangerous.
Yes.
If it's merely cognitive tools, right? The moral and emotional base has to catch up, because
yes,
force equals mass times acceleration killed a lot of people and ruined a lot of families.
Yes.
So the cognitive level has to be matched. Otherwise, it's evil if the moral and emotional development isn't keeping pace. So that's a problem in the school system. And what does the school system need to do? How do we need to conceive of education in order to make it viable at these increases of power that are coming? And so I wonder about you, because you seem to be very tuned into this through a love of historical awareness, right? You seem to have a very deep, very empathic understanding of evolution and role playing and how different societies turned out, and a long view of history. I wonder how you got that, and I wonder how important you think that is in anchoring people in the capacity to take higher perspectives and inhabit more powerful cognitive platforms.
Well, I think it's important for me to be doing it. I mean, that is I am under such pressure to do this. It's not what you do what you do. Other people do what other people, systems engineers do what systems engineers do. This is what I do. Now, as to the question of how I got this way, I was born this way. I mean, my basic personality type is INFJ on the Myers-Briggs scale. So I'm by nature intuitive and empathic. And I love cultural history. I love it, love it, love it. I mean, Tolkien's Lord of the Rings came out when I was 15. I lived in Middle-earth for 2 years. I mean, that's why I ended up becoming a medievalist. And I just love that stuff. But as I was finishing my PhD, I did not find my spiritual path. It found me and kind of hit me upside the head with a 2x4. I started meditating seriously and discovered that there are levels of truth and beauty and reality far beyond the intellect. And so I finished my PhD out of sheer stubbornness and bailed out of academia to really devote myself to spiritual practice. I've been meditating, with some lapses, between 2 and 3 hours a day for the last 39 years. And part of the answer is, at a certain part, I started remembering past lives. Funny things happen when you meditate a lot. And whether they are really past lives, I don't know. I mean, they could be just something my deep psyche is spitting up. They could be channeling other past. I don't know. But that, combined with my scholar's knowledge of cultural history and my empathic, intuitive nature, have put me on the track I am. And since we brought it up, I will say, I mean, I remember being a Viking. No, we're not going to lose the strengths we gain at the barbarian stage. That is, I exist, by God, and I am going to go out there and impose my will. Well, I did that as a Viking. It just having, and one of my projects, if I ever get my novel out there, will be to take the characters in it and then their next incarnations up through the different layers of culture. That would be a fun thing to do if I get that far. But so I can say that my sense of putting myself in these other characters and trying to really experience life from that point of view, I have to do it as a novelist to begin with. But then I also tap into the empathic, intuitive, and the just kind of, okay, let's pretend this really was a past life, whether it was or not, and just, okay, what was it like? Oh, shit, some of the stuff that comes up. And then, oh, wow, some of the beauties. I mean, every one of us is a face of the Buddha, all the way back to the very first Homo sapiens and maybe before. I mean, and this gets into the purely spiritual side, which I know you are anchored in also. These levels of spiritual realization that the Jesus and Buddha and all of the great wisdom teachers tell us, that ultimately we are not separate beings. There is a higher superordinate order that our intellects cannot grasp, but that we can experience. And Ken Wilber has a lot to say about this. Even the people who have experienced it can talk about it, and they know what they're talking about. We cannot adequately define it with words, but there is something very real out there. And as we start to tap into that individually through spiritual practice or just spontaneous openings, there are strange attractors at those higher levels that are pulling us up. And that also, you know, I don't say go into this kind of stuff with everybody, Layman, but I mean, there is a top down also. We are doing this bottom up. Everything we've talked about today is bottom up. And but it's kind of like as we reach up, I think of it, my metaphor is like in lightning. We see the bolt of lightning that comes down from the heavens. But before that visible bolt of lightning comes down, there's an invisible leader stroke that comes up from the ground. And then the bolt of lightning comes down. And actually it goes back and forth in several pulses, like the HTTP protocols, the pings back and forth to establish. I mean, there are pings back and forth between that superordinate order and the level at which we are operating. And they operate invisibly for most of us. Occasionally in a Christ or a Buddha, they come through in a major way that changes civilization, but they're operating all the time. And that is really where my confidence and optimism comes from. There is a higher order, and we're not alone in this.
The people who are working on integral post-metaphysical spirituality, it's a way of thinking where you can't do away with metaphysics completely. You need a metaphysics that supports the idea of a post-metaphysical approach.
Yes.
And that's anchored in the fundamental structures of the intelligibility of reality. Right, in the core syntax of what enables worlds to exist.
Mm-hmm.
And that, whatever that is, right, when we have higher experiences, even sometimes you see the face of God and you don't know whether it was there before or it occurred just in this moment, whether it's the leading edge of evolution or whether it's a fundamental structure of reality. Mm-hmm. But either way, the ability for it to show up has to be encoded at the most basic level of reality. It has to be possible for that to have happened. Yes. So in some sense, the higher is also the lowest possible thing.
Agreed.
That's a very beautiful vision.
Agreed. It's innate.
Yeah. Let me bring it back around to male-female in an odd way, which is about 20 years ago, I had just left a Buddhist Sangha and moved to Japan. And I had a wonderful series of meditative evenings when there was a big earthquake, and there was an earthquake inside myself as well. At first, I had memories of my birth, of entering into that baby.
Wow.
And the odd thing is that's now spliced in my memory, right? In my own memory, that's at the beginning of the timeline, but it showed up later, so it's very suspicious. Yes. And there were a number of seemingly past life or alternate life memories, right? These fragments of alternative narratives that I unexpectedly saw into and highly resonated with. Now, the interesting thing to me about those, or one of the interesting things, is I was male in all of them. So I'm wondering about
Really?
yours. Or did you have male past lives, or were they, generally speaking, female past lives?
No, I've only remembered 4 or 5 in any detail, and I have impressions of the others, but I think I went back and forth. It seems to be about an even split.
Okay. Now, I suppose we're at the length of time beyond which it's not reasonable to expect anyone to listen to this. Let's bring it to a close. I noticed that you sent me an email saying that you'd won a dirty song contest. I wondered if you could perform this song for us.
Oh gosh, you would bring that up. I just sent those in case you ran out of. You don't run out of interesting things to ask. Okay, let's see if I can do this. I have not totally warmed up. This is Bobby Burns. Okay, I think this is the one. Basically, I just knew more dirty songs than anybody else did, but I think this one may have done it. This is Robert Burns, so it's not pornography. It is high culture. Let's see. Now, this is a female approach to sexuality, definitely. Come tell me, dame, come tell me, dame, my dame, come tell me truly, what length a tool, when used by rule, will serve a woman duly. The old dame wagged her wanton tail so ready. I heard a song in Annandale, 9-inch'll please a lady. But for a country cage like mine, for we're not made so gently, I'll take 2 thumb widths to the 9. Then there's no finer handle. Come nudge me, Tom, come nudge me, Ned, come nudge me, do it straightway. Come let your bull out of his pen and bang him away at my gateway. 9-inch'll please a lady. Robert Burns.
High culture, ladies and gentlemen.
Maybe that'll encourage people to listen all the way through.
Yeah, we'll advertise it at the beginning.
We'll just skip to the end.
Thank you, Karen. This has been a wonderful conversation.
Oh, this is I knew this was going to be fun, Layman. Thank you for inviting me.